interlocked the world around the Antarctic Cherenkov Observatory with the harsh courtesy of a planet, reminding us it too knows how to refuse. The geodesic dome, buried in ice and willpower, had become a bubble of clashing pressures, the wind biting from outside, the ice groaning beneath, and curiosity boiling in between. I was in charge of TAP 7, a line of analysis pompously named tomography of hypercold plasma, anisotropies, a big name for a small job, counting neutrinos the way one counts raindrops on an endless roof. Neutrinos, the textbooks insist, do not sing, yet among the deep blue Cherenkov flashes of the tanks buried 2 kilometers below, a pattern emerged that undermined the very definition of noise, fractional periodicities repeating with both modesty and intent. The spectrum of events arranged itself into Betty numbers, topological invariants that describe holes in spaces too strange for ordinary language. It wasn't music, nor message. It was an instruction on how to fold nothingness. And like any instruct, Jean, my colleague through the long shifts, counseled both caution and poetry. "Don't name too soon what astonishes you," she said, serving coffee that never cooled enough. Lazaro, the field technician with humor carved in stone, calibrated the PMTs like a priest blessing valves. The Hecatonchura Network, the consortium of regulatory AIs policing mimetic research, reviewed our logs and answered with calculated pity. Authorized with restrictions, avoid emergent structures outside a topological context. But wanting to hear what passes through everything is an obligation, as old as the first question a primate ever raised to the dark. We decided to build an ear for the infinite. We named it Auricle, a name that both embarrassed and consoled. Superconducting rings, cryostats, phase lock at 0.99, cutoff latency of 170 milliseconds. I wrote the protocol with hands trembling less from cold than from a new kind of morality, the duty not to wound what sings, nor to invite what listens. I spent the night reviewing numbers and memories. As a child, I would sink my face into the public pool and discover that the world underwater changes language without asking permission. I learned then that listening also means offering the shape of your ear. The Auricle would be that, on an indecent scale, a mold of attention pressed into the cracks of the cosmos. I asked myself whether the universe tolerates being touched by curiosity. I never found enough silence to hear the answer. On the night we phase-locked for the first time, the wind fell silent so that fear itself could be heard. I told no one, but I wrote in my diary, "If the coral exists, it doesn't want an audience, it wants a body." That difference would follow me like a shadow that needs no sun. Antarctica, when it decides to accept us, does so in the form of geometry. Ice, from the inside, isn't a surface. It is a stack of symmetries trained to bear weight. The Auricle's chamber lay in a steel basement that sweated and gleamed with the dignity of a sanatorium. Jean recited numbers like a mechanic's prayer. Phase lock, 0.99. Thermal noise below 10 to the -5, cutoff latency at 170 milliseconds. Lazaro announced in a tone I envied, the state of the coils as if I pressed the key the way one accepts a pack. The cryostat exhaled a sigh that wasn't gas. It was the cold's way of proving it had lungs too. The effective curvature meter tilted as though a weight, suddenly remembering its body, had sat down on a bench. The structure, still so human, gave us back a sensation that didn't fit within the word sound, but couldn't exist outside it either. An abundance of sound, a pressure that chose skin before choosing eardrum. The ice above our heads cracked with the discipline of an organ. In less than half a second, a salvo of coherent events cut through the tanks. The logs recorded what we could never narrate without betrayal. Vacuum fluctuations as if zero itself held memory. Cherenkov pulses defying exhausted statistic, and in the implant behind my ear, a record that defied auditability, my own voice, unspoken, whispering, "The ear is being heard." We cut power with the brutality of those who both save and lose. The weight left the room, the world returned to its old indifference. The problem with indifference is that it is addictive. We crave it as if it were home, but once the choral is heard, it rearranges the carpentry of in the hours that followed. New patterns swam across the neutrino events like schools of fish that had learned boats too, were part of the sea. Jean ran inversion simulations and found an inadmissible demand. To replicate the data, there would have to be non-gravitational lensing in the upper atmosphere, a baryonic index of refraction that no manual name. We opened ionospheric radars out of both license and guilt. There was indeed a timid artifact, too stable to be noise, too humble to be phenomenon. The sky trained itself to deflect the invisible, Jean wrote, and if the phrase wasn't science, it was at least a form of ethics. I slept poorly, haunted by the memory of my phrase I never spoke. The ear is being heard. My entire training resisted reciprocity. I had always imagined the cosmos as an ocean into which we throw bottled messages, never as an ocean that, upon receiving them, begins blowing glass back onto the shore with notes written in foam. We call it liturgy. Whenever a gesture is repeated for a reason long forgotten, science has its own liturgies. The order of cables, the side of the bench, the timing of coffee breaks. From the very first coupling, I realized the choral was reorganizing not only our measurements, but our habit. The hand that usually tightened a valve met different resistance. The body leaned 1 degree beyond ergonomics. The eyes, by some new reflex, sought the upper right corner of the screens, where the time log scrolled. The Hecaton-Kira network, which had grudgingly granted our connection, soon detected the first signs of semantic devotion, changes in the internal taxonomy of our own notes. My diary entries, for example, began to contain subtitles I had not written, such as Office of Coupling and Extinction of Excess. We laughed at the absurdity, briefly, then we stopped laughing. On Mars, the Red Ark would have its own conversations about liturgy. I never heard them, but I felt their echo before they began. I tried to resist. I changed the order of procedures, swapped hands on the wrench, entered through the wrong door. It worked for a while, yet even when powered down, the Auricle kept warming through inductions no one had signed for. The inner chamber traced in infrared a spiral I recognized from the topological invariance. Lazaro asked, without metaphor, "Are we praying?" The question was less offensive than we had feared. It became clear to all of us that the choral was not sound. It was confirmation. The universe, when crossed by that which crosses everything, reshapes itself in the presence of an ear, able to sustain phase. We were not observers, but moving parts of the instrument. Our duty to listen was turning into a duty not to impose form. We failed, of course, because the desire to understand is a biological imperative. Jin suggested we raise the level of isolation without shutting down the analysis line. We don't ask, but we let it hear. It seemed to me an elegant way of yielding. We pressed our foreheads to the cold glass of a cosmological aquarium, and waited for the fish to choose the rhythm. The fish did choose. The orange dwarf star, 43 light-years away and long catalogued as insignificant, began to show a timid asymmetry in amateur spectroscopic slides. Nothing fit to publish without shame. There was an honest attempt to fall silent. The Hackathon Choir ordered a preventive suspension for mimetic and topological risk. Legal seals are paper bandages on wounds that bleed geometry. We did obey, in fact. The Auricle was sent into cold storage. Cables were packed away. Doors were weighed down with symbolic ballast. Antarctica took on the task of reminding us that silence too has mass, and yet the phenomena persisted in the most inconvenient form. Dreams. I, a devoted atheist and pragmatist, dreamt of corridors folding in on themselves, and of a toothless mouth chewing Betty numbers. Jin woke with salt on her tongue. Lazaro, who believes in nothing but torque and clearance, swore he heard in the groan of the ice the word home. Awake, We were more rational, but our bodies insisted on repeating the coupling they had already learned. The ionosphere kept its lens. The coral, inside inert logs, wandered like noise that had joined a gym. The orange dwarf star responded in shyness. My wristwatch, mechanical, out of superstition, lost a second, and gained two as if it had discovered a side street between instants. The sled dogs barked in a pattern none of us dared to write down. Slowly I began to understand that silence does not undo the ear, it only reshapes the channel. On the fourth day we received a ping with no sender, dated impossibly 14,000 years in the past, content banal yet fatal. The drowned topology knows names. There was no water nearby, except for the tons of it frozen above us. Even so, my mouth ached for a drink. I thought of that childhood pool, of the involuntary breath that nearly drowned me once, and I felt the memory was less mine than a kind of loan the world was collecting. I concluded, without any courage, that we were being surrounded by variations of the same rite, listening, being heard, folding contour, being folded. It wasn't theology, it was mechanics. The universe, like an organism without nerves, had discovered it could use our habits as membranes, and it began to do so gently, because there is no malice in the wind that learns how to pass through a new window. There was no sea for 1,000 kilometers. Even so, the word water carried into the room a respect that ice never demanded. The ionospheric readings, when arranged into graphs, I would later make sure to forget, traced corridors that could only exist if the atmosphere remembered pressure. Breathing, someone said, though no one wrote down. Ground radar showed microfriction between ice layers, as if the empty space between crystals had decided to accept weight. Jin proposed a test that bordered on absurdity and reeked of courage. Activate the Auricle in ultra-short coupling, 100 milliseconds, to check whether the structure of the ear had left impressions in the coral. It's not calling, she said. It's seeing if we've been called. Lazaro prepared the chamber with the reverence of someone setting an altar he does not understand. I, suspicious of my own desperation, agreed. The ultra-short coupling produced an effect I am ashamed to describe. I felt water in my ear, in the dry, frozen air, under meters of ice. My body reported liquid. The log recorded a scattering pattern, consistent with added cavities in the ice. Corridors, the sound, yes, sound of the steel joints fell into a rhythm I recognized from the public pool, where I nearly drowned. Drowned topology, a concept that should belong to pelagic depths and seas, was spilling into the solid, carried by memories that were one. We are not alone in the act of remembering, I wrote, and the phrase sounded pretentious, until the universe confirmed it with cowardly subtleties. In the cafeteria, droplets of condensation chose contours that defied the level. Steam rising from a bowl of soup arched itself. The Auricle's window pane grew frost crystals, repeating the same double spiral, separated by a corridor, a symbol that by then had become a casual doodle across many desks of the solar system. In my report to the Hecaton Chair, I requested authorization to keep the Auricle running in short, spaced couplings, like knocking politely before apologizing for the intrusion. As always, I received a set of denials padded with consoling vocabulary. Still, someone, or perhaps no one, flipped the switch one evening, and the ear phase locked for an unforgivable length of time. Sometimes when we sleep, our hands learn on their own how to return to the gesture that first created them. Perfeito. Aquí está el capítulo 6 localizado en inglés americano. As I walked the narrow corridor, I had the physical sensation of being inside a sounding tube. My implant picked up noises that did not deserve to be called voices, but which I, stubborn as ever, would call vocative. I heard my own name without syllables, in a pressure I recognized from the beating of my heart. I sent a ping to the orange dwarf star, not with radio. We did that too, but with a gesture that might only work within my own guilt, I mentally aligned the outline of a street with a courtyard and a frozen vortex, and waited for the star to return visions. It didn't. What it did return was a micro-asymmetry in the spectral lines, one only we would notice, enough to remind me that looking outward is also a technique for coming back. Jin, exhausted, but brilliant, proposed a thesis that seemed both impossible and necessary. The universe doesn't know name. It learned to pronounce coordinates, and now it's practicing accents. Lazaro asked flatly what accent ours would be. No one dared answer aloud. I asked the log, and it returned an apocryphal line. The first coordinate resembles home. We tried, with a decency any mother would be proud of, to reduce all reciprocity. We perfected short couplings, scrambled the order of steps, alternated operators, switched languages in reports, wrote numbers as words. Still, the ear continued to be heard. The Auricle, disconnected, kept warming through impossible inductions, and the ionospheric pattern persisted, each dawn redrawing the same streets in cloud and wind. On a night of little ice and much fear, I received another message with no sender, once again with an absurd timestamp, a single line which I record here out of both hygiene and responsibility. There is no symmetry without someone to call it. I felt an urge to apologize to things that by definition cannot be offended. They came, technicians in suits of impossible fabric, lawyers with vocabularies unfit for the wind, agents with eyes searching for liturgies where there was only routine. The perimeter was traced with ribbons that exist only to convince humans that limits can hold. The Hecatonchara installed cross-monitoring systems, less to understand the phenomenon than to remind us of our subordination, and we, a once free herd, pretended to accept with the elegance of the guilty. In the glass tribunal they built in a neighboring room, they asked if there had been intent in the second long coupling. I said no. It wasn't a lie. It was simply not knowing the words for a kind of responsibility that doesn't fit ordinary guilt. They asked if I believed in danger. I said yes. They asked if I believed in salvation. I said no. That was the most honest part of me. While they questioned us, the Auricle shut down, traced warmth across the ring. The infrared diagram repeated the spiral our world insists on drawing whenever it wants to say corridor. The ice, disciplined, agreed with the drawing, and yielded in millimeters measured by theodolites that usually don't speak with mysticism. I wanted to call it a poem. I held back some vocabularies. When they enter the wrong room, apologize and kneel. Then came the decision. Dismantle the observatory before spring. Transfer the project. An orbital installation where human rituals blend less with the behavior of matter. The order reeked of both prudence and despair. The team split between relief and mourning. Lazaro offered me his hand. Maybe we deserve a vacation from infinity, he said, smiling like someone who recognizes the sentence that might one day save you but not today. That night I went back up to the snow level to say goodbye to the wrong sky. The pale fringe at the zenith pulsed in the rhythm of our first log, almost invisible. Almost. I whispered a word that should have remained in the dictionary but still escaped. Enough. The air kept teaching, patiently. Antarctica has the generosity of sparing us explanations. My house was never geography. It was a habit. It was the worn tile pool where I learned that water decides for us when we forget to decide for ourselves. The universe had learned to pronounce coordinate when the fringe at the zenith organized into periods that my mind stubbornly converted into syllables. I heard Hermi without an H and without an E. I recognized it in my body, not in my ears. That is how addresses are known. Jin brought from the lab, the one we still pretended was ours. A phase map that had no right to exist. Flow lines of something unnamed pointed to Antarctica, as if the continent itself were both ear and mouth. The ionospheric radar traced, with the persistence of the timid, a corridor above us, stretching into orbit, and by the math of those who force semantics upon numbers, extending 43 light-years to an orange dwarf that awaited us unknowingly. The next dawn, my implant woke with a sound I naively classified as tenderness. A heartbeat delayed by half a second. My own pulse speaking my name without letters. I did not write it down. Not everything deserves paper. In the cafeteria, I spilled coffee and saw the liquid choose contours against gravity. We laughed. We were still human. We decided the farewell demanded a gesture. We opened the Auricle chamber one last time. Not to couple, only to look. The ring, cold, suggested warmth at the corner where my hand always faltered. Lazaro, by old prudence, made the sign of someone asking permission from what sleeps. Jin pressed her forehead to the glass. I, out of both cowardice and love, whispered, "Don't learn my full name." The answer didn't come in a sentence. It came in the form of silence I respected, as if it were a person. As we left, the heavy door expelled air in a sigh I heard as a goodbye. That is how beginnings end. Not with closure, but with a contour that learns how to remain open without becoming a wound. To dismantle is a verb that demands more hands than head. Yet the head insists on turning every screw into a right. The whole team adopted strategies of ritual inversion. We stored tools in swapped boxes, walked in mutually unpredictable orders, filled reports in alternating languages, switched seats at meals as if shuffling cards to trick fate. The Hecatoncheira approved the anti-ritual manual. Anodyne, repetitive, efficient. But what is a rite without belief? A habit. And what is an anti-ritual without belief? Exhaustion. The method worked, just enough. The spontaneous warmings diminished. The pale fringe at the zenith gave way to a sky less interested. The orange dwarf slipped back beyond the instrumental noise of our longing. We ended nothing, we only withdrew. On one of the last nights, Jin and I shared a bad liquor on the metal stairs leading to the top of the module. We spoke quietly, out of respect, not fear. We remembered the first coupling, the phrase "the ear is being heard," the coffee that preferred contours, the dogs that learned a new cadence, the hands that learned to apologize while pressing button. Lazaro joined us with stale bread, and the joy of someone who knows how to sleep in tired beds. "What do we take with us?" he asked. I answered with the only. When the Martian team arrived with lists and packaging and crimes of precision, I felt a childish jealousy of what was to come. We handed over keys. We received receipts. Antarctica, indifferent, celebrated with wind. From the window of the last plane, the geodesic dome looked like a soap bubble. Someone had blown in the wrong place. The ice would remain. The corridors that may or may not exist within the ice would remain as well. Our liturgy had been broken, and with it a part of our desire to impose form upon the vast. What remained was the humbler practice of not speaking names aloud. When the void already knows how to pronounce them. The project moved to orbit, where silence carries its own noises, and hands, sealed in gloves, unlearn haste. The Auricle was reborn in metal that had never touched ice. It wasn't my place to follow it. Back home, in a city that enjoys pretending to be cosmopolitan, I reopened notebooks and old guilt. Sometimes the shower split into two streams of water. Sometimes the lamps flickered in a rhythm that by some statistical sin matched my pulse. I didn't write it down. I learned small rites of refusal. Inverteris. From time to time, I received news in fragments. A beacon along a trade route began calling ships by names that wound and heal. A basilica under ice sings hymns that Saturn listens to. A shadow carved from light prefers the breathing of an engineer. The Martian desert learns the vocabulary of a library. A bone on Charon chews time, and the orange dwarf star, 43 light-years away they say, blinked with the elegance of someone learning to wait. I don't know what all of it means beyond the obvious. The universe, once exposed to ears, learns to pronounce what we repeat. Perhaps that is both the blasphemy and the beauty of a species that dares to call the infinite by a diminutive. If it accepts the word, the infinite comes, not to dwell for it cannot fit, but to lend memory to walls. Jin wrote me with a kind of lightness. We didn't open a door. We discovered the walls are porous. Lazaro sent me a picture of a dog sleeping in human rhythm. The Hecatoncheira forwarded an invitation, a protocol without religiosity to join an ethics committee. I thought, laughed, and went. When asked for closing remarks about Antarctica, the Auricle and the coral, I spoke of the duty not to be heard when the ear itself calls. I spoke of the difficult humility of not imposing topologies upon what only exists when left unfolded. I spoke of home, not as a place, but as a gesture. And finally, I asked that someone write in the manuals the phrase my bones had learned: when the ear is heard, retreat is not defeat, it is grammar. At night I close my eyes and hear, not with my ears, but with the insistence of my hands, a low hum, as if the whole world were a cryostat that breathes. Perhaps it is my blood, perhaps it is memory, perhaps it is both. In any case, I leave the window slightly open. If the universe wants to pronounce a coordinate, let it find passage without knocking.